we don't need US aircraft to shoot down Russian aircraft going into Polish airspace. We have European aircraft. It just seems that the Europeans have been too scared to use them in those situations because they're worried about what the escalation might look like on the other side. So I think it's very interesting that Trump has essentially given the green light to NATO European nations to shoot down Russian aircraft if they enter NATO airspace.
Let's talk about Ukraine then. Volodymyr Zelensky making, a very straightforward, a very direct speech at the United Nations today. He really, I suppose, his message was about broadening the issue of Ukraine to other nations, saying, look, if this is happening to us, it can happen to you. And now we see the evidence of that. NATO airspace around Estonia, Romania, Poland, are all being eaten into by Russia. They are starting to push the boundaries. Putin is starting to test what the might of NATO might be. Here is Zelensky addressing the UN nations today.
Even being part of a long-standing military alliance doesn't automatically mean you are safe. Just recently, 19 simple Russian drones violated Polish airspace, and only 4 were shut down. Luckily, they were not shaheeds or even worse. Otherwise, the results would have been horrific. Estonia had to call a UN Security Council meeting for the first time in history because Russian fighter jets deliberately entered its airspace.
Vadim Prystaiko, the former Ukrainian Foreign Affairs Minister, believes the UN as a mechanism for peacekeeping isn't effective anymore.
Don't forget that UN been criticized for not being effective and active all years around. And history tells us that each and every major catastrophe, major crisis is sort of giving birth to some sort of understanding of international efforts to be united in promoting peace. League of Nations, now UN. And it seems like by this time of possible, probable, I don't know, hopefully not, the war, which is coming wider than Ukraine. The mechanism which we call UN now is not effective. And it's now quite obvious for everybody, not Ukraine only.
Albie, if NATO is a defensive alliance, does that have to stay true to its word? I mean, an attack on one is an attack on all, is the sort of famous edict of that. But I wonder whether NATO as a defensive alliance is the right approach for this. If we're talking about the threat of Russia, should NATO just defend, or should they in some ways attack?
I think NATO always has to be a defensive alliance in order for it to continue on this platform that it has of not being a threat to Russia. But it's actually got to properly defend itself. And I think one of the things that was quite interesting about what's come out over the past few days was actually not necessarily in Trump's speech or indeed in Zelensky's speech, but actually in a press conference, which both Zelensky and Trump were present at. And Trump was asked whether or not NATO nations should shoot down Russian aircraft if they enter NATO airspace, to which Trump responded, yes. Now, that's different to what Marco Rubio said earlier on in the week when Donald Tusk suggested that NATO was ready or Poland was ready to shoot down Russian aircraft entering Polish airspace. Marco Rubio said, we'll only shoot down the aircraft if Russia's attacking. Trump the next day says, well, if they enter airspace, shoot them down. So I think that's quite interesting.
But he's not offering US aircraft, by the way, to shoot them down. This would be a European effort.
But we don't need US aircraft to shoot down Russian aircraft going into Polish airspace. We have European aircraft. It just seems that the Europeans have been too scared to use them in those situations because they're worried about what the escalation might look like on the other side. So I think it's very interesting that Trump has essentially given the green light to NATO European nations to shoot down Russian aircraft if they enter NATO airspace. I think another interesting part of Zelensky's speech was this emphasis that he's had on weapons. He said at the beginning of the speech, if a nation wants peace, it still has to work on weapons. It's sick, but that's a reality. Not international law, not cooperations. Weapons decide who survives.
Yeah, and there's a bit of a dig at the UN in there as well. He's effectively saying diplomacy aside, international law aside, his lesson is only weapons will do this, which goes against what you hear from most sort of esteemed ambassadors and diplomats, that actually war is largely, ending wars are about diplomacy rather than weapons. I wonder what Donald Trump would say about that. I mean, he's an expert. He's ended 7 wars, largely with diplomacy, actually, it has to be said, rather than weapons. Diane Hayter?
Well, I mean, 2 things. One is, of course, this isn't new that an attack on Ukraine is an attack on all of us. And that's why we saw Finland and Sweden so early joining NATO after the invasion of Ukraine. And it's why I think Britain and the other allies have been so strong. It wasn't, I mean, it's very, very important to be alongside Ukraine. But it was also, if we don't stop Russia in Ukraine, then of course he'll go anywhere else. And as I say, Finland and Sweden very quickly join NATO. But the other thing is, I mean, I think the issue of shooting down something going over either Estonian or Polish land is really important. It would be a very difficult decision. But frankly, what Putin is doing is now testing NATO. He's trying to say, are you serious? And I'll go, a few yards over, a few feet over, and then a half a mile over or whatever, to see whether we will respond. And undoubtedly, NATO is going to have to respond. Otherwise, we will not be credible as saying, yes, we will defend any country that he wants to move into. So I think there will be at some point a very nasty incident. And the Turks did it once before, didn't they, some years ago? But essentially, if we keep allowing him sending aircraft to infringe NATO airspace, and we don't stop it, then it will continue. So I do think that has to happen. Many other things are needed. Clearly, the American acceptance of that is not, as Albie said, we don't need their aircraft to do it. What we do need, and I think that is the signal, is they won't switch off intelligence and they won't switch off support if any of our European NATO allies do have to take that action. So I think it is the acceptance of that they won't then be difficult that is the really significant thing of what was said.
We spoke to Dominic Tricand earlier. He's a former head of the French military mission to the UN in NATO. He said Donald Trump does need to stand alongside NATO allies if any intervention is to be successful.
The answer he gave was just a question of a journalist, and he replied just like that without knowing really what are the rules of engagement in NATO. So I think it has no sense to do and to say that. So my point is just that we need to have all together US aircraft, European aircraft, and to show to the Russian that we are all together within NATO. And I'm pretty sure that they will be more careful about that.
I suppose we talked about this briefly a little earlier, Albie, but Donald Trump has signalled in words that he is united, or certainly more united with the European point of view on territory in terms of ending the war and what Ukraine might be able to or should have back. It's now whether his actions mirror that. And that's the really tough thing, because it doesn't necessarily fit with America first. It also means extra money being spent or more American resource being sent to Ukraine. Zelensky's message today, as you said, is just, we need weapons. Now is not the time for, acting soberly, prudently. This is what the German defence minister said should be the order of the day. Zelensky just wants weapons. He just wants to fight this out.
The problem with Trump is, regardless of what he's said over the past couple of days at the UN in New York, it seems that he's come round to the European position. The question is, in 48 hours, will he have changed his mind? When he was asked in that same press conference, has Putin let you down, or do you trust Putin? He said something along the lines of, I'll let you know in a month's time. So again, there's sort of this staking of a position, a good position, it might sound to British Times Radio listeners. But then at the same time, he's saying, well, in a month's time, Putin might send me a signal that means I trust him. So then what does that actually mean? Will these words translate into actions? We might like what we're hearing, but will it translate into actions? I think that is a valid question.